The Sony ZV-1 was announced back in 2020, and in the beginning, many criticized it for not being the great vlogging camera it was made out to be. But what if instead you looked at it as a great beginner's camera, the first step up from a smartphone? A nice way to learn all the necessary camera controls and how it works without feeling too intimidated. I am a beginner and I've used this ZV-1 now for over 2 months. So let me tell you all about my experience and my thoughts with it after using it. Let's go! First up, a little disclaimer. This is not going to be a super technical review. There are channels on YouTube that do very well at that, and if you want to know about all the specifications and how well it does in low light, the dynamic range and stuff like that, just maybe check out the video by Gerald Undone or DP Review. Today, I want to focus on my experience as an actual customer in the real world. First up, I want to give you a short conclusion if you're just here for that. If you're someone who wants to turn photography or videography into more of a hobby and move up from their smartphone, the camera world can seem quite intimidating at first. There's so much to know about, so many different models and so many things to consider. I think the ZV-1 is actually the best beginner camera you can get. As a beginner, the thing that's gonna help you most is just going out and shooting more. Taking more photos or videos, whatever you're into. And the ZV-1, due to its great portability, because it just fits in your pant pocket really easily, will make you do that. It will help you go out and shoot more. It produces great results when you just turn everything to auto, but at the same time, you can control everything manually and you can learn about how cameras work, and that will help you if you upgrade to a bigger camera later. There's not much to think about with the ZV-1. You basically just need the camera, maybe a few extra batteries and an SD card, and you're good to go. You will be able to go out and start shooting very quickly, and you won't have to sit at home learning about camera stuff. Instead, you can just learn on the job, which is not only more fun, but also more effective. So therefore, as an overall conclusion, yes, I think this is the best step up from a smartphone overall. And if you want to learn more about the particular pros and cons of this camera, stay tuned. But first, let's switch to the ZV-1 so you can see what the image actually looks like. Okay, so now we're on the ZV-1 at 24mm in manual mode. I tried to match the setup as closely as possible, so it shouldn't look too different from my other camera. But let's get back to the review. Let me start with the pros first. The biggest one for me is portability. I can fit this into my pant pocket easily, and that means I can take it everywhere I want. When traveling, I take this with me every day because there's just no reason not to. I only have to take the camera and maybe an extra battery, and that's it. This is so convenient because in terms of portability, this camera is much closer to a smartphone than to other cameras. And the next pro for me with this camera is the focal range. 24 to 70mm is a great standard zoom focal range. You can go from pretty wide shots to kind of medium telephoto range, and that is great for everything except for vlogging. And I think in the beginning many people hated on the focal range of this lens because Sony marketed this camera for vloggers. But since I don't vlog and I only use it for like travel purposes, this is a great focal range for everyday use. And if you don't vlog, I would definitely consider this over the newly announced ZV-1F that has a 20mm fixed lens, because the zoom is just very valuable to have for different shots and to get kind of different angles when you're traveling. And another big pro for me is the image quality. If you had a scale from like smartphone image quality here to mirrorless camera professional image quality here, the ZV-1 for me is more towards the professional camera, while at the same time, as I said, it's in terms of portability closer to a smartphone. It just doesn't have that over-processed computational photography look that smartphones have, and I don't really enjoy that, so for me this ZV-1 provides much better image quality. Also, even though it's not perfect for that, you can get a pretty blurry background with this camera if the background is far enough away from your subject and you zoom all the way in. That means you can get a really professional look for your images even from this small camera. And even in low light, if you ask me, this camera works better than a smartphone because it doesn't have that kind of over-processed night mode look. It just looks more natural and it doesn't look as bad as smartphones sometimes can. Another pro to consider is that it has some useful functions that will make it easier for beginners to use this camera. For example, there's a background to focus mode, and essentially all it does is kind of open up the aperture and adjusting the rest of the exposure triangle to match the exposure you had before. And that is something you can do manually if you understand how a camera works, but if you don't and you just want to get that blurry background, it will be really helpful for you because it's easier to understand. Next up, if you have been paying any attention to the camera game over these past years, you will know that Sony is at the absolute top of the autofocus game. You might argue that Canon is up there with them, but no one will argue that Sony has one of the best autofocus systems in the industry. And the great thing is that an autofocus system can be deployed to all cameras. So you can get it in the cheapest camera like the ZV-1, and it's gonna be as good as some of the best cameras Sony makes. So that means if you want to show products, for example, if I hold up my AirPods to the camera, it will just autofocus all the time. And it's very easy to change the autofocus speed. So for example, I've set it to a lower speed so that it doesn't kind of bounce back and forth, and it looks more cinematic, if you ask me. And that is just great to have. You don't have to worry about autofocus with this camera because it just always works, and that is such a convenient thing to have. It just works every time with whatever you hold up to the camera. If you cover the face, it will focus on the closest item to the camera. If not, it will be so sticky on the face and will not lose you. There's also a great feature called autofocus tracking, which is so helpful for product videography. You can just hold something up to the camera, you tap on it on the touch screen, it will focus on it and will just keep it in focus wherever you move it in the frame. So you can see it works very well, and I just love the autofocus of this camera. Okay, enough about autofocus. Next point on the pros list for me is that there's no NDs or lenses required. Everything you need is in the camera. So for example, if you might consider this or a ZV-E10, they might seem very close in price, but with the ZV-E10, if you want to have the best video, you will need a great lens and great ND filters, and then you will have a better image than on the ZV-1, but it will be much more pricey. With this camera, everything just comes in the box. All you might need are some extra batteries, but we'll talk more about that later. The next pro for me is that this camera, even though it has great beginner functions and you can use it mostly in all auto mode, it still has all of the more advanced features. You can shoot an S-Log if you want and color grade later. It's only 8-bit, so you don't have that much flexibility with your footage, but still you can just get used to all the more advanced settings over time, and then when you want to upgrade, you will already know about all the settings. The next pro for me is coming back to the point about this camera being an all-in-one package. It also has a great microphone built in. Obviously, this is not going to be as good as an external mic because you can't bring it as close to you as you can with an external solution, but it has a wind muff included for when you want to use it outside. It's really good for kind of a built-in microphone, and in the beginning, you won't need anything else. Next up for me is the price. This camera in Europe is about 600 euros and in America it's going to be probably around the same in dollars. And if you compare that to especially iPhone prices, which have risen everywhere outside of the US, this is a great camera to have. If maybe before you might have upgraded your phone just to get a better camera, now it might be a consideration to just get this camera, which is better than a phone camera in most situations and is probably less than a phone upgrade. For the price of this camera as an all-in-one solution, I don't really think you can do any better. And especially as a beginner, where you might not be sure about whether or not you really want to pursue this hobby long term, this is a great investment. And last but not least, I also like the flippy screen. I know some people don't like it, especially for photography, because it's not really in one axis with the lens, but for videography and if you want to film yourself from time to time, or maybe just want to take travel pictures of yourself and your family, it's just great to have this flippy screen. And even though it's not perfect for photography, I think it's still pretty useful. But enough talk about the pros, let's talk about the cons of this camera. And the first one has to be the battery. I mean, this is not a huge issue because you can just buy more batteries, and especially these batteries are pretty cheap on Amazon if you buy third-party ones, but still, the battery life is just really bad. When I film one YouTube video with this camera and I film for like 20-30 minutes with some time for setting up before, I will have to use 2 batteries because one is not enough. So whenever I go out with this camera, I always take at least 1 extra battery. As I said, it's not a big deal, you can get extra batteries, it's just a minor annoyance and you'll have to live with it. Next up, the stabilization is also not the best. It doesn't have IBIS, it only has lens stabilization, and by itself that is not really enough, so you have to use the active stabilization setting, which crops in a lot and is still not the best stabilization, so especially compared to a smartphone, I think the stabilization could be improved. Also, of course, this kind of comes with the portability of this camera, but it doesn't really have a lot of physical controls. Other cameras will obviously have more because they're bigger, and that will be more enjoyable, but you have to kind of live with it if you want a camera to be this portable. And a kind of adjacent point to this is that it doesn't have an EVF, which is also because it's very light and compact. I know Sony's RX100 series has an EVF, but it's still a weird EVF, and with this camera you get the microphone instead, so you will have to live with only the screen. Overall, this might be a negative if you're coming from a smartphone and you're kind of looking for the real camera experience, where you kind of have an EVF, you look through it and you have the traditional photo experience. This camera will not really provide that, but at the same time, you will have the portability, so you will just have to decide what's more important to you in that regard. I think this is especially important for photography. For videography, it's not really a huge deal if you ask me, but for photography, I think most people are really looking for the EVF traditional camera experience. And that also comes with more controls usually. I can live with it because that's kind of what you sign up for if you want the portability of this camera, but what I don't understand is that the touchscreen controls don't work better. If you have a camera with not a lot of physical controls, but that has a touchscreen, it would be great to be able to control menus and other stuff on the touchscreen instead of having to use the little tiny D-pad. I don't really understand why camera companies don't really get this right. Most camera companies should technically be able to let you use the touchscreen to control the menu, just like you're used to on a smartphone. But even though they all use touchscreens, you can't really use them if you're inside of the menu. I know Sony has introduced some features that go into this direction on newer cameras, but there haven't been any firmware updates to the ZV-1 that will enable this. Next up, this is also kind of something I also had as a pro, but you can see it from the other side, and that is the lens is fixed on the camera. That is great if you don't want to have to buy a bunch of lenses, but obviously that will limit your flexibility when it comes to kind of getting different focal ranges or a different type of shot if you want more shallow depth of field, for example. And another minor annoyance is that the tripod mount is just very close to the battery door. So if you have it mounted on a tripod, you will always have to unscrew that if you want to change the battery or SD card. That is especially annoying because the battery life isn't really good and you will probably have to change batteries at least once per shoot. And so you will always have to unscrew it, maybe then you screw it on a little bit differently and you will have to reset your setup, and that can be quite annoying. With the ZV-1F that Sony has announced recently, this is fixed, but on the ZV-1 you will have to live with that. And last but not least, I think there could be more video settings available on this camera. For example, every smartphone can do 4K 60 now, and this camera is still limited at 4K 30. You can do 60 frames, but only in 1080p. So yeah, I would just want to have at least some slow motion in 4K. I can understand that this camera will not be able to do 4K 120, probably due to overheating, but still, it would be great to at least have 4K 60 to slow it down 50%. Okay, those are all my pros and cons of this camera. Let's switch back to my usual setup for some final thoughts. Okay, so back on my usual camera setup to talk about my final thoughts. I think this camera is for you if you're someone who wants to do video mostly and you're maybe starting a YouTube channel, or you want to take some travel videos for you and your family. Essentially, it's just the best first step after a smartphone. It will save you most of the fuss of other cameras where you have to find out which lens to use or which settings to use. It will just do all of that for you and still produce great results. If you think about this and maybe versus the newly announced ZV-1F, I think they're both kind of at the same price, at least in Europe. And for the same price, I would still get the normal ZV-1 because you have the zoom range. And if you don't absolutely need the wider lens of the ZV-1F, I think the zoom is just more valuable to have. All in all, this is an awesome little camera. I love it. I still take it with me everywhere and I love traveling with it. If you're someone who wants to get into videography, I think you'll love this one. It'll help you learn and you can grow with it. And I bet you that even if you upgrade to a bigger camera later, you'll still want to use this because it's just so portable and so much fun to use. Alright, I hope you learned something today and you enjoyed the video. If so, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.